Thank you for jumping on. We want to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. Our topic of discussion over this next hour is going to be focused on Salesforce's CPQ product, but more specifically, mastering CPQ deployments, expert tips, and some best practices. Okay, perfect. Today from the Gearset side, we have me, Andrew Callie. I'm a sales engineer here with Gearset, and I'm also joined by my colleague, Alistair, another sales engineer. Our role in this presentation as it gets rolling is really going to be to monitor that chat. So come say hi to us, hit us with any of your hard-hitting questions. We'll be there and interacting with everyone. Pass things over to Deepak to get into the fun stuff here. I really wanted to take an opportunity to introduce our partners at Cloud Giants, those who are going to be leading us through our discussion today. A couple notes on Cloud Giants. They've been a Salesforce Consulting Partner since 2014. They've completed over 200 engagements during that time frame, and they have a 90+ net promoter score. And their specialty in Salesforce really lies within the CPQ and Revenue Cloud products. But that's enough for me here on the Gearset side. At this time, I'd like to give the floor to Deepak. So Deepak, take it away.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Deepak Veera. I am a principal consulting manager here at Cloud Giants. I focus in CPQ, and I've been heavily focused there ever since CPQ or Steelbrick became integrated with Salesforce. So I've been doing that for the last 5+ years. I have what seems like I've done a collective month's worth of CPQ deployments in total in that time. So this topic is very near and dear to me. So I'm excited for what we have in store for you.
And I am Mangum. I am a technical consulting manager at Cloud Giants. I've been working with Salesforce and CPQ for 6 years. I've worked on many CPQ projects in a variety of capacities, both working and building CPQ solutions, as well as working through CPQ deployments as well. Like Deepak, I am super excited to be talking CPQ with everyone today.
All right, I'll get us started. We have a pretty wide audience group here. I think some of you are, of course, DevOps managers. You're probably CPQ admins, Salesforce developers, or maybe you don't fall in any of those buckets. You're just curious to hear more about what CPQ deployments look like. Maybe you're considering buying Salesforce CPQ and you want to make sure your DevOps process is well aligned for that. Wherever you are, we invite you to join. As Andrew mentioned, we welcome some audience participation. So we'll be curious to get your feedback and some thoughts as we go through the presentation. But the main objective, what you should expect to get out of this is, I think for me, it's really twofold. One, a strategic framework. So DevOps processes are not going to be the same across all companies. It's going to be informed by your company size, and in this case, also your CPQ complexity. So we want to give you some tips from our side of things you can consider as you develop your DevOps process for your own org internally. But just as well, we also want to, from our experience, give you some practical tips that's helped us. So I hope you walk away with some pragmatic things you can put into use in your work, but also some considerations on a more strategic level. Okay. So why are we talking about CPQ deployments? We threw out a couple of words. There's DevOps, there's deployments, but what makes CPQ deployments so challenging? I have heard this joke that CPQ, contrary to popular belief, does not stand for configure, price, quote. It actually stands for causes people to quit, because it's very, very challenging, right? I think what's interesting about CPQ is what it does well. It does well in saying we don't need a developer to put in all this logic. And the way CPQ does that is by having record level data that acts as metadata. Right. So I think makes it functionally easier for an admin to configure and develop is probably what is costing us on the deployment side. So all that to say to the first bullet, CPQ configurations, and this I think is the main point here, we have record level data, think price rules or product rules, that act as logic and they do function as such. So we need to make sure that those are accounted for when we move to new environments. But Graham, maybe you can speak and expand on those here.
Sure, yeah. So building off of Deepak's point, another challenge with CPQ are the object and record level dependencies that exist between the data the custom objects that are a part of the CPQ package. The ability to create these awesome bundles, product and pricing automation, and quote templates sort of necessitates the need for this complex data architecture. And so there are all these dependencies between these objects that exist, and having these dependencies makes deployments more difficult. You have to maybe necessitate the need for external IDs as part of your CPQ configurations. Maybe even consider the use of a deployment tool to make sure that those dependencies are all preserved properly as you're moving through environments. Because when these dependencies get messed up in your CPQ data, you'll oftentimes run into errors that at times can be difficult to interpret and take time to fix. The next challenge that we'll talk about right now is that CPQ solutions often depend on both data and metadata. So oftentimes with a CPQ solution, you're maybe deploying some custom fields alongside the need to deploy a price rule, which exists in data. We can't add data to things like change sets when we need to move our configurations from one environment to the next. And so that's a consideration to keep in mind, is how are you going to both move your data as well as moving any pieces of metadata that are also part of that same solution. So I'm going to pause right here. Those are a few challenges that we often see at Cloud Giants, but there are many more. So I would love in the chat if you could post any other deployment challenges relating to CPQ that you often come across.
Just looking at the chat here to see if anyone's got any other thoughts on some of those challenges. Thank you, TK. We have one about an exception to rules. Allison, thank you for the comment here. Knowing the dependent objects for each object being deployed, definitely a big one there. A few others.
I think those are great call out. So I'm thinking, yeah, like when you're doing a manual data deployment for price rules, you can't deploy a price rule with a custom condition. It has to be all or, like any one. That's one. It's sort of a pain. And of course, dependencies on objects too. I think like Allison mentioned, where especially if you have custom fields to your CPQ objects, you have to make sure to include them in your query scripts.
We had one more here from Nick talking about backup considerations. Definitely a great consideration here, and specifically restoring active orders. Another challenge we hear.
That's a good one.
All right. Thanks everyone for inputting there. Again, we invite you to sort of actively chime in. We'll be monitoring chats and we'll have some opportunities for questions at the tail end too. So let's dive into the meat of today's webinar. As Grant and I were brainstorming, I think there's really 4 key conceptual areas and considerations that we sort of have crafted here for you. Just the game plan for today, Grant is going to kick us off talking about the standardization of documentation. Grant will then cover the need for testing. There will still be a need for it. We shouldn't shy away from it, and Grant will kind of dive into some detail there. And then building on those two, we'll wrap up today by talking about how those inform our deployment strategy. And then lastly, what a DevOps tool for CPQ does for us.
Great. So the first tip that I will cover is the need to standardize documentation. It really is true. The right level of documentation will make your life a whole lot easier when it comes to CPQ deployments. And there are a few types of documents that Deepak and I will swear by, we really like to use at Cloud Giants. And so I will talk about each of these here. The first one is a change log. You may already use this type of document in your deployment process, regardless of if you're using CPQ or not. It may exist with some other name, but really what I mean when I'm talking about a change log is a list of items that have been created or changed that will need to be included in your deployment. This is particularly helpful with CPQ since, like we mentioned, you are combining the need of moving both data and metadata. It's hard to have a consolidated place to have both of those things. If you're using change sets, you can only store your metadata there. If you have spreadsheets with data, or however you're managing your data in order to migrate it, that may exist somewhere else. So consolidating it into a single change log can be very helpful. It helps organize the team and just keeps everyone on the same page of what's moving as a part of this deployment. A change log, we find that a change log can be super helpful when you're really capturing things like, one, the name of the component that needs to move. So whether that be the name of a price rule, the name of a flow, custom fields, the names of page layouts, whatever it is, just capturing the name line by line, each of the things that will need to be deployed, as well as other data points like, is it metadata versus data? If it is data, what type of data is it? Is it a price rule? Is it a feature or a product option, quote template? You get the idea. Same with metadata. What's the metadata type? Custom field versus flow, whatever. Just capturing things like that just makes it clear for everyone involved to know what each item is that needs to be deployed. If you're considering implementing a change log, I would recommend that you don't over-engineer it. I think there may be, you may feel the need to add a bunch of different data points, but I would caution you to keep this document accessible, keep it a tool that is helpful for the team and not a burden, because if it is a burden, people will stop using it to its full potential. And that, of course, is a risk when it comes to your deployment. So just balancing the right level of detail in your changelog is key if you do decide to implement that. The next type of document I'm going to talk about are pre or post-deployment checklists. So CPQ is a managed package. You could view it almost as an app of sorts that you install in a Salesforce org. When you install this managed package, there are all these managed package components that are a part of this package that get installed into your org. All of the objects that we've been talking about, plus other things like the quote line editor and so on. We are able to customize parts of this managed package, but because CPQ is a managed package, that means that we cannot add any managed package components to our change sets in order to deploy them. Oftentimes, we're adding to pick lists on objects like price rule or product rule, or price action or price condition. We're adding to those checklist or those pick lists, but we're not able to deploy them through change sets. So you have to consider, how are you going to make sure those changes happen in the next environment? And a pre or post-deployment checklist is an answer to that. Really what this is just a checklist of the manual steps you'll have to take as part of your deployment to make sure that everything is recreated in the next environment so that it works correctly. And really the benefit of using this is that it's a consolidated place that the person who's managing the deployment can go and act on each step, and just helps overall ensure a smooth deployment for everyone. Lastly, I am going to talk about a data load script. So this is a pretty much CPQ specific document that is going to be super helpful if you are doing migrations of your data from environment to environment. So depending on the size of your deployment that's involving CPQ configurations, you may choose to either manually recreate your configurations in the next environment if it's a small deployment that involves a handful of things, or if it's a larger deployment, you may consider doing a data migration. So this was mentioned in the chat as being a challenge. The order for upload is important that you're getting it right. There are those dependencies which we've discussed that exist between objects. So it's key in order to make sure that your deployment goes as smoothly as possible and you aren't running into errors, that you're deploying in the right order so that you aren't blocked by those errors that arise when there are certain things missing on the records that you're trying to upload. So for example, you need to upload price rules before you can upload price actions or conditions. And similarly, you need to upload quote templates before you can upload things like template sections. And those sort of dependencies exist through a lot of the different CPQ configuration objects. And so having a script that you can go to each time to make sure that you're doing it in the correct order, step by step, will save you time and is super helpful. Now, our next tip is talking about testing, embracing testing. I think everyone here, we would probably all agree that testing is a key step in any development, any deployment process. And like Deepak mentioned, that doesn't change with CPQ. In fact, there are types of testing that we find super beneficial when you're working in CPQ, doing CPQ related deployment or any CPQ development work. And so the first type of testing that I'll talk about is post-deployment testing. You may also refer to this type of testing as smoke testing. And really what I'm talking about here is immediately after a deployment, going and testing key functionality, like using the quote line editor or generating quote documents, or even just looking at key processes that touch CPQ that users are going to be using and there could potentially be issues. Going and checking and making sure that all of those things are usable and are not blocked by any sort of errors that may have come up over the process of deploying to the environment that you're going to. This is important because I've seen this many times. If you've deployed CPQ configurations and maybe a relationship between some of the data is off, or in our pick lists and the CPQ objects, we've entered in a field API name slightly incorrect. When someone goes to, say, the quote line editor to start building quotes, they're completely blocked. They can't even save quotes. And for sales users who are trying to do stuff quick and get things out the door, they're not going to be happy. You're going to get bombarded with messages asking for help, and that never feels good. And so taking that proactive step of going in, checking to make sure things function properly, and identifying any mistakes or issues and addressing them as soon as you can, hopefully before those end users get in there and start working, is a great idea and something we definitely try to do. The next type of testing is that's super helpful with CPQ is user acceptance testing. We find that UAT is key for CPQ projects, especially getting that feedback from the sales users who oftentimes know how products should be set up, or how pricing should work the best, getting their input as soon as possible to help us as the admins or developers make sure that what we've built is correct and meets their needs. This benefits us because it makes us look good, where we can more quickly build and produce what end users need, but also it empowers those users who are getting involved with UAT, gives them extra chances for training, but also empowers them to be super users and go out and help other users who aren't involved with UAT as they're maybe learning the system, learning the products, whatever. Getting those users involved with UAT is very helpful for CPQ when it deals with these high use things like building quotes and messing with products and pricing. So I am going to pause right here again. We've discussed both documentation so far and also the need for embracing testing. in the chat, I'd love to hear what other types of documents maybe you and your team use, as well as other types of testing you feel are important.
Okay, here's one from TK. For testing, we talk about seasonal discounts, approval chain of commands. Allison, another comment here. We have one Excel sheet that combines all these documents, and I find it super important. We do all these types of testing, but also add automated regression testing for each release. A very nice addition there, Allison. And then Nick, we use a run book as a single checklist as the deployment progresses. All great comments here. Thank you for throwing some thoughts in there.
Okay, let's turn now and build on what Grant just discussed here. So next, let's consider what a deployment strategy looks like. So I'm guessing just by virtue of the title of this webinar, and I think the sponsor here, we are probably all big fans of processes, right? We are drive towards process. And I think with the end, I would wager that we do that to mitigate risk. One thing that's, I think as consultants, we often think about, and Grant just mentioned it here too, is things like how are we driving user adoption and how are we providing value, right? And I think that's something I want to discuss here. You might remember I was saying we will need to consider how this looks for your particular organization, considering complexity and size. But a key item that I want to call out here is let's not have process just for process sake. That's just bureaucracy, right? So really what we're looking for is how can we accelerate time to value while balancing that against risk? So for example, if you are deploying a key, I think somebody had a question on product bundles earlier, right? Like that we'll need to have a little bit more testing, some post-deployment testing like Grant just discussed. On the other hand, if you're just adding a quote level field, that's just a view layer, we don't need to necessarily have the same level of, a process that goes into it. Now, depending on your company and other teams, there might be a need to standardize across the board. And again, that is going to be a business decision that you'll need to make. But again, as you're considering a deployment strategy, make sure you're not forgetting that we do this with the aim of ultimately providing value for the user. So anytime we can accelerate that and articulate that and drive adoption, I think that's a way that I think DevOps benefits. The next item here, cutover plan. I think this is worthwhile calling out. So just like any other functionality, but probably here more significant is we are deploying functionality that is key business drivers. So there's salespeople that are actively building quotes. They're probably actively negotiating with customers. Maybe it's in the middle of an approval process. And making changes that impact that could be may not be well received. So the main item here is when you're deploying things like price rules, product rules, or product options bundles, consider the impact that it might have to in-flight quotes. So for example, if there's an existing bundle and you're adding new product options, when somebody goes in and clicks reconfigure, it'll change things. So you might need to inform the user in some capacity. If you're changing price rule functionality, that'll also impact in-flight quotes. So make sure you do consider that. You might want to do this during off hours, or at the very least, or in addition to communicate to end users to make sure that they're informed. The next item here, we have thus far talked about, conceptually, we've created deployment. We're deploying what documentation do we need? What sort of testing do we need? How do we communicate to the user? How do we accelerate time to value? But also remember that once all this is done, we have to turn around and refresh sandboxes, which if we're just talking base level metadata, it's super easy, right? We just go into our production org and we click a button and it refreshes our orgs for us. But remember, as we said in the very beginning, we have CPQ data in here that functions as metadata. That CPQ data, that's again, price rules, product rules, et cetera, will not automatically move into your sandbox. So as you're developing your deployment strategy, make sure that you're properly allocating time to deploying those records to your sandboxes again after refresh. This might inform the cadence in which you refresh. This might inform sort of if you want to stagger your lower environments, you may refresh one week and another one a separate week. But again, the main item here is make sure you are allocating enough time for that in your deployment strategy. Now let's talk about a deployment tool. And I think this is where things get a little bit more interesting and hopefully fun. CPQ deployment tools are really cool, and I cannot emphasize how valuable they are just in terms of like predictability and just time savings. Grant discussed some documentation earlier. We discussed things like change logs, pre and post deployment checklists, and our data load order. With a deployment tool, we reduce the documentation needs and complexity. So for example, a data load order script is irrelevant, right? We have the ability, because a tool will automatically account for the object dependencies and will move them over. It knows the logic in which to deploy. We no longer, and this has been a particular experience I've had, right? Like I've spent many a times at a coffee shop waiting and just populating spreadsheets and doing lookups. So making sure I'm deploying things correctly. This happens in a couple of clicks, which I think is a big time saver. The next item, deploying with confidence. What does that mean? So I'm embarrassed to admit I have spelled API names incorrectly for price rules and then spent hours trying to troubleshoot why something wasn't working. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. For me, on a given Friday, I would love to know that a deployment is going to take X hours, and that'd be a pretty good measure. Instead of spending time off hours and weekends trying to troubleshoot things and find why things aren't working. So the less manual work that we have, the fewer errors we ought to expect. And for us, from our experience, that's just meant more confidence with predicting time. Lastly, we discussed on the last slide, the sandbox refreshes, right? We know that that's also a pain. You have to do a data deployment every time. Again, with a deployment tool, deploying CPQ changes, you can go from production to lower environments as well. So just like you might click a button and refresh the sandbox, here in a couple of clicks, we also have the ability to seed sandboxes with CPQ data again. Okay. So far, we've discussed our key considerations. I want to turn now and discuss a tool that we use here at Cloud Giants that we've been using this year, and just kind of go through the ways in which it's benefited us as well here. So we are a consulting shop, right? Literally for us, the way our business works is we bill our clients and we want to provide them value. Gearset's tool, their CPQ tool for us has meant, and I've highlighted this before, has just meant much more confidence and time savings, which then means we can take that time and provide more value for our clients. And maybe for you, it looks different, right? It means probably more predictability instead of saying like, I have a deployment, I need to block off my entire weekend because things go wrong. But let's discuss some of these items in more detail. This deploying managed package components is not possible with change sets. So what is a managed package component? Grant mentioned this, that CPQ, it can be viewed as an app that we're adding on, but with that comes dozens of object model relationships and possibly, hundreds, if not thousands of record level data that are also in there that have dependencies. I mentioned my embarrassing story a little while ago with spelling a price rule API name wrong. With a change set, you cannot deploy picklist values that you're adding onto price rule because it says that this is a managed package field. You cannot deploy it. With Gearset, we do have the ability to deploy picklist values that we've added in. I think also, although it may seem small, considering the complexity that it adds on, it has to be accounted for in pre and post deployment checklists. Being able to do this as part of deployment is a huge value add, in my opinion. The next item, Grant mentioned this earlier. Deploying CPQ as metadata or with metadata, I think is a huge value add as well. So what do we mean here? We know, for those of you that have used Gearset before, we know that we can go in and in a view, see all the metadata components have been changed or they've been added in. I also mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that really what CPQ aims to alleviate in configuration is added complexity in deployment. Again, record existing as functioning as metadata. In this layer, being able to view data as metadata, it makes life a lot easier for us. We can also view dependencies. So just like you would say, if you're deploying a page layout and there's a field you forgot to add in, Here too, if you're deploying a price rule, it'll point out that you probably forgot a price condition, that you can see that and drill down and add the price condition as well. So having those both in one screen, one UI makes life a lot easier for us. And I think that's something we've also benefited from. Lastly, the pre-deployment problem analysis. So like users of Gearset may be familiar with this. In addition to change sets validation that Salesforce runs, Gearset will run a problem analysis beforehand that'll point out just the dependencies we may have missed that'll make our deployments more successful. The same functionality also exists with the CPQ side as well. So I just mentioned this a little while ago. If I've added in price rule, but I forgot to include my price conditions or price actions, well, or at least Salesforce is not going to catch it. It doesn't know. But the problem analysis tool will also point out the dependencies for your CPQ data components as well. I think as we sort of conclude this, I think one other item I'll add on is just, I think from us being a consulting shop, we've also gotten feedback from other consultants that have used this tool. And on a given Friday, deploying and going through these monotonous processes, checklists, and this querying of data, making sure we're populating lookup IDs, going from all of that, which I think one of our consultants was saying, normally what takes us 4 hours, I was able to get done in 20 minutes. Right. So to me, it's like that's more value we're adding to clients, but it's also, for me, it's a better quality of life for consultants, right? I don't know if any one of us would say, I love the drudgery and monotony of data deployments and troubleshooting where I messed up, right? But simplifying that, getting more confidence, I think has been really key for us. And that's something I think we would gladly talk more about. But Grant, I'll turn it over to you to go through the slide here.
Great. Yep. So just to recap before we open it up for questions, what we believe are the 4 most important CPQ tips for mastering deployments are: 1, standardizing your documentation so that your team has what they need in order to organize a deployment. Embracing testing so that you and your end users are set up for success. Crafting a deployment strategy to fit the needs of both your users and the organization as a whole. And then finally, investing in a DevOps tool to both decrease the time spent deploying and increase the quality of life for the people deploying.
All right, great. Well, that brings us to our question and answer section here. So many good insights there from Deepak and Grant. Thank you guys for delivering that to the group here. Hopefully everyone got some nice things to consider out of that. At this point, like I said, we are going to move into that Q&A session where we can dive deeper into any topics that we've discussed as a part of this and field any questions that may have come out of there. For those of you who have to jump at this point, a quick heads up that we do have just a very brief anonymous survey that's going to pop up in your browser when you leave the webinar, as well as that will be sent to your email. We would really greatly appreciate you filling that out. Your honest feedback is very appreciated. With that said, let's get into that Q&A. So feel free to come off mute if you have any questions or type into that chat. We've also had a few other topics that have been being discussed behind the scenes here in the Q&A, or in the chat. So we had Puneet, you talked a little bit about pre and post deployment checklists. I thought Grant and Deepak, if you guys wanted to maybe start there, we could talk a little bit about some of what those have looked like and throughout your experience in working with different customers. We had Hanjda, who asked a question about those differences between CPQ advanced approvals, as well as that native Salesforce approval stream. Just a couple things to get us kicked off here, but let's open it up to any questions and we can dive into any of those challenges too. So Deepak and Grant, I think maybe a good place to start might be talking a little bit about what you guys have seen in those pre and post deployment checklists. Any context that you wanted to maybe provide Puneet, who asked a question just about that? I mean, if you guys have any examples of specific items on there, different things you guys have seen might be helpful.
Sure. So I think some of the key things when you're doing a deployment that'll always be in a pre or post deployment checklist will be, if you're not using a deployment tool, any of those manual steps relating to your CPQ configurations that have to happen in order to set up that solution in the next environment. So specifically, some of those items would be adding pick list values A, B, and C to this field on this object. So adding the API name for my new custom field to the target field on price action, things like that. Those manual steps, updating the managed package items that you can't deploy through a change set would be something you would often see, depending on the method which you're taking to get those configurations from the sandbox to either the next sandbox or production, whether that be manually recreating each item or doing a migration. Just having that called out in your script as well will be helpful. The list of price roles that have to be created, or the list of bundles that have to be created, or if you are electing to do a data migration, a pre-made, linking out to like a pre-made script, that deployment order script that we discussed, to make sure that you upload all of those records in the correct order. Doing that would be things that you would include. You can also include maybe some non-CPQ things that you want to remember to do, like alert users that the deployment is finished, or activate flows. You can really make it your own, but when it comes to CPQ, really the things that you'll want to keep in mind are any of those manual steps that can't be a part of a deployment package. You'll include there. I did see someone in the chat mention the executing scripts in the CPQ package settings. That's a great one that I would definitely recommend including. I think we've all come across a weird error happening in CPQ, and everything else you've looked at isn't resolving the issue. And so you go to the package settings and you rerun post install scripts, and magically it's fixed. It doesn't oftentimes hurt to run those after a deployment, just to maybe get ahead of any weird things that have happened with CPQ. The package as a whole, with the automation specifically, is somewhat of a black box, and you don't have a lot of visibility into what's happening. And that can just fix things that we can't see on our end because it's a managed package. So I would definitely include that as well. That was a great call out in the chat.
Thank you, Grant. We had a couple more that are coming in. We've had some comments a little bit about refreshing down into lower orgs. We had a couple questions about best practices for what types of orgs should contain CPQ configuration. We've been speaking to those a little bit in the Q&A. Let's see.
I think maybe we'll, I see one here from two. It says, are there any scenarios that we have to deploy CPQ configuration data manually? I think that is a great question. Grant, I'm curious to get your take, like given I don't know, like let's call it an average, or from our experience, CPQ configurations, anything CPQ related, we would have to do it manually. I'm hard pressed to think. I think the one thing I like to call out here is a common CPQ use case is using a custom pricing lookup table. So here we have a custom object that we would create that has records, and a price rule would look up to it to populate price. With Gearset's tool, that also is included, can also be deployed. So I haven't had a need to go in and do that manually for any reason. But outside of that, I'm not sure. I don't know, Grant, maybe you can chime in. Any other things we have to do manually?
Nothing comes to mind when you have a deployment tool like Gearset. It really does just about everything you need for a CPQ deployment for you. You're able to manage it through the the interface through the tool. And that leads to a lot of those benefits that Deepak mentioned, where you're saving time, reducing the need for documentation because there's so many less manual things you have to do, therefore less human error. So yeah, I can't think of any situation where you would need to do something manually rather than use a deployment tool if you do have a deployment tool that you can use.
We've also had a couple questions from Rajesh about automating sandbox refreshes. I'd be curious to hear if Grant and Deepak, if you guys have seen any tooling that might help with that. I know on the Gearset side, we've talked a little bit in the chat about our external ID wizard that certainly helps that refresh process a bit with CPQ, but any light you guys can shed on any types of tools that you've seen or maybe interacted with, or just any tips and tricks for making refreshes easier?
So I think there are the two ways I'm going to come at this. So if you do not have a tool that you can use to help with your deployment or help with a refresh, the data load order script that I mentioned is going to be very helpful so that you can make sure you're pulling your data down and then uploading it into your sandbox in the correct order. Anyone who's ever done that knows that it takes literally hours. It could even take days, depending on other, priorities that you're juggling. So, that sort of leads you to, I think, to this question, like, how can we automate that? How can we make that easier? And I don't know of any tools that automatically kick off refreshes, but I will say that Gearset, the CPQ tool with Gearset, is super helpful for moving your CPQ data down to a sandbox after you've refreshed. Just not too long ago, a colleague on the Cloud Giants team actually did this. He was spinning up a new sandbox, and he wanted to move. It was a developer sandbox, so no data, no CPQ data, and he needed to move the CPQ data to that sandbox so that they could start building. And he used Gearset to deploy from production to that sandbox, the CPQ configurations. And it took a matter of minutes, way faster than what it would be if you were to try and upload any of that manually. So, like, I know Deepak and we would highly recommend using Gearset for that. You do have to click a button to kick off the movement of those configurations to the sandbox. But overall, the time that it takes is greatly reduced, significantly. Yeah.
Thanks, Grant. Got a couple more coming in here. One from Hanja. Is this statement true? CPQ metadata migrate from lower environments to prod, but CPQ data need to refresh from prod to sandbox as post-deployment manual process. It depends, I think. I don't know if Deepak and Grant, if you wanted to maybe take that and run. I'm sure you maybe have used Gearset. We do allow you to deploy those things upstream as well as downstream. But any context that you guys have ran into as it relates to moving CPQ and migrating it from lower orgs up, but then what that process looks like to potentially get that downwards into some of those lower orgs. Any context that you guys have around that?
I can talk to that. I think Henry had a similar question, so I'm hoping we can sort of answer both. We will need to think of this as from a lower environment, think of CPQ data as another deployment, right? And the short of it is that we can't deploy CPQ data as metadata, so we need a different tool for that. Now, once we've gone from a lower environment to production, we need to refresh our sandboxes. So there, if you don't have a CPQ tool, yes, you will have to manually query data, make sure you're using lookup IDs, and then populating that, or importing that into your lower environment sandbox after the refresh has been completed. So it's we'll need to refresh, we'll need to deploy on from a lower to a higher environment, and then refresh from a higher to lower. Having a deployment tool, a CPQ deployment tool, just automates that and makes life a lot easier for us. Let's to Henry's question. Yes, so if you don't have a full sandbox, you cannot, I think only product records really move over that CPQ uses. Everything else will be lost. So you will have to, again, manually export and import data again. But something like Gearset's deployment tool will make that easier for you. You can do that with a couple clicks.
All right, great. Anja had another follow-up question here, asking a little bit about DevOps Center and what their support for CPQ looks like at the moment. Deepak and Grant, might throw that over to you if you guys have seen anything that they've come out with. Of course, here on the Gearset side, we have seen that the DevOps Center has come out, and we're following their roadmap. But I guess I'll start with Grant and Deepak. Anything that you guys have seen on that side?
I have not seen anything. I don't know what has been done with the DevOps Center relating to CPQ. I would imagine, that this is a very specialized piece, a CPQ deployment, because it does involve this data element, as opposed to just standard deployments that involve just metadata generally. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that hasn't been addressed by the DevOps Center, but really, I'm not sure. It isn't something that I've looked too much into. So if anyone in the chat knows, would love to hear that, but I can't say.
Yeah. And what I've seen too, just generally speaking, is looking at that roadmap with DevOps Center, they're kind of doing iterations here of adding support for additional things. As far as I know, at the moment, they don't have CPQ deployment support. So I think that probably would be the general answer to that, Hanja. But of course, if there's any follow-up that you might want on that, you could reach out and say the word. So, okay, we have one more from Rajesh. Can you list a few features unique to Gearset, which you have used in your experience, but are not present in usual CPQ deployment tools, such as Blue Canvas, Prodly, and you and your team felt the advantage of opting for Gearset? Again, I'll throw it over to Deepak and Grant. If you guys have any thoughts, I certainly could kind of come up with a couple of my own as well, but I'll let you guys take that one first.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll take a stab at it. I've used Prodly before, and for me, it has been challenging and can be a pain to have that installed in a Salesforce instance. I think having an external website and a UI they can go into that queries that data makes life a little bit easier. And this has been a few years now, Prodly also felt a little bit more cumbersome to set up, right? And again, but it also tacks on this like added layer of you have your regular deployments, but then there's also this separate, albeit maybe, easier to do CPQ deployment. With Gearset, I think I enjoy it because it's a one UI. And again, going back to the point of having CPQ data functioning as metadata in one UI, I think is a big benefit here. Blue Canvas, on the other hand, I have used, I know that they made developments recently. There have been limitations I've run into, particularly when you're deploying product bundles where there's many product options. So I think there's I've had issues with it running up against like max record level, and I haven't been able to deploy. So my takeaway then was, hey, like this may be a good tool, but deploying product bundles is not really great here. So again, for me, it's as I'm thinking to process this, I'm thinking, what can I streamline? How can I take the thought out of it as much as possible and simplify? And I think to both those reasons, these are both tools we've looked at and I've used. Like my preference in lean would be for Gearset.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, that covers a lot of it, Deepak. Of course, Rajesh, if you feel like you want any more context, we can certainly speak more to it. But I think that was a great way of laying it out there, Deepak. And Rajesh, thank you for the confirmation there. But with that, we'll go ahead and wrap. I think if anyone has questions, like I said, we're going to be hanging out. Last thing I'll mention, Of course, you can get in touch with our partners from Cloud Giants if you wanted to talk more with Deepak and Grant. We have their link here that you can see. Feel free to visit their website, learn a little bit more, and these guys would love to stay connected with anyone that have interest in that. Oh, we do have a couple more. It looks like maybe have come in from Hanja, so we can hang out here for a second, Hanja, and speak to that. What's the billing adoption rate for your customer base? So say what percentages now of your customers are using Salesforce billing? Again, I'll throw that over to you, Deepak and Grant. What I would say on the Gearset side is we do see a smaller slice of customers that are using the billing aspects of that CPQ solution. To put a percentage on it, I might say something like 20 to 30%. Deepak and Grant, though, feel free to leverage any of what you've seen and if there's different answers from your guys' perspective.
I think there's been interest in Salesforce billing. I don't know if there's any projects that we're actively working on at the moment where the customer also has Salesforce billing. On the other hand, CPQ Plus is the majority. So by that, I mean CPQ and advanced approvals, right? Both of them there. My take on the Salesforce billing tool, I feel like it is a little bit more on the younger side, and I think leaves some to be desired. It is really nice to be able to automate the invoicing process in Salesforce, but going into the ERP and the handoff can be a little bit complicated there. But I've had experience implementing that project. The customers have seemed to like it.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up then. We got around a minute remaining. Thanks again so much for those of you who are still on the call here. Really enjoyed all the insights, all the questions. And Deepak and Grant, any last comments from either one of you?
I think great audience. Thanks for attending. This has been a blast, and we'd love to keep in touch.
All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.